Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with someone to discuss life with schizotypal personality and I guess to give a little bit of a glimpse into the internal world of people with schizotypal personality. So maybe just to start with, would you be willing to share some of your earliest signs of schizotypal personality, maybe any indicators that you had in childhood?
Of course, yeah, thank you for letting me be here and speak on schizotypal. So throughout my life, I always saw the world with so much color and interest in everything. Even the small details that I think people would overlook would just be utterly fascinating to me. And I could learn about the world by just watching paint dry. I think I always describe myself as a little bit odd, odder than other people. Um, Even after being diagnosed, I mentioned that they talked about childhood signs, and looking down the list, it was kind of crazy to see, oh, well, I had this during childhood. One of the mentions was paranoid ideation. When I was a kid, unfortunately, I always thought that burglars going to come in, harm me and my family and steal from us. And I'd have these like CPTSD responses. Like I'd always have to face doors. I had a little like protective stick next to me just to make sure I'd have a contingency and a counterattack in case this would happen. Another example is magical thinking. I remember when I was in probably about middle school, I took this book off my teacher's desk and I noticed, oh, if you line up the first word or the last word of every line, it was giving you a secret message, which sounds crazy, but at the time, and my teacher was playing cool about it. But stuff like this, just kind of makes you realize, oh, I had this during childhood, for sure.
Well, thank you so much for your answer to that. So the next question is, I guess, maybe just going a little bit more in depth into some of the traits that you mentioned. So we've kind of come up with a list together. So I'd love to go through them one by one and hear whatever you're comfortable sharing for each trait. So the first one is hyper reflexibility. Would you be willing to maybe first explain what this is and then discuss how you experience it?
Yeah, so I apologize in advance. I'm not sure if I spelled it right. I think it's hyperreflexivity, but regardless, it has to do with like people overthinking a lot, and we just analyze everything we do, what we observe, and I find that we think more about the past and the future more so than the present. I'll give you an example that happened about a couple years ago, and I was sitting in on a guest lecture and I had all these different thoughts, and I think it really presents like how much we do overthink that extent, which just seems so detached from what normal people think. So I thought that the lecture was really interesting, and I really wanted to ask questions because I was really interested in the topic. And immediately I thought, oh, what if I screw up the pleasantries, or wait, how are conversations supposed to flow? I'm not really good at that social thing. Oh, but I don't like small talk. This is ridiculous. This is absurd. Why would I even do this? This is weird to approach them. I don't want to take too long, and maybe they have something to do after this. But we don't want to ask questions like we're insulting their intelligence. So, and oh, wait, I don't want to misrepresent the university because I'm sure there's much more smarter people. Maybe I should let them ask the questions. Or, oh, maybe I need to write this down before I forget, the topics he's talking about. And, you know, um,
Yeah, that that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, personally, at least I definitely relate to that kind of, I guess, style of intense analysis or intense thinking. And I appreciate the example you gave for it. The second element, and I know you touched on this a little bit in your childhood, but would you be willing to maybe describe a little bit more about what it's like to experience paranoia and whether there's specific situations or factors that exacerbate paranoia?
yeah, so I know for me, I just believe every interpersonal interaction is like a mental chess game. Every word is carefully chosen. Every physical movement someone makes, even if they're just like brushing their hair, to the side, means something. And every topic they bring up is crafted to like kind of suit their goals or what they want out of the conversation. Um, and I think we just overthink, and it has to do a lot with that hyper reflexivity for sure. And I think the way we present to other people, it seems very careful. Like we're trying to only say certain things. It seems like maybe we're manipulating people, but no, not in the slightest. We're actually just thinking so hard about how we're presenting that it seems like that. But no, we're just so focused on like what we're doing, and we're like overthinking our movements and what we're saying. So, because we don't also want to give information that might be used against us.
Yeah, absolutely. And then for reality checking, would you be willing to describe that?
Yeah, so reality checking is something that I had done, but I hadn't even realized it was a good tool to combat like paranoia, suspiciousness, ideas of reference, a lot of the kind of concerns and downsides of the disorder that I've already mentioned. And it's just a really critical skill that I found helps me kind of ground myself. And it's one that everybody has to learn for sure.
And the next two, I kind of lumped them together, but just let me know if they should be separated. They're sort of a savior complex and delusions of grandiosity and egocentrism that's different than what someone typically might have with, for example, narcissistic personality. So would you be
Yeah.
willing to share a bit about the specific delusions of grandiosity you experience? Is this something that kind of comes and goes? Is it pretty constant? And maybe also to elaborate on how this might be different from what people with narcissistic personality on average might tend to experience.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I find that it does come and go, and as you get older, it kind of becomes more of a ridiculous idea that, oh, I'm so much, um, or I guess I'm more destined to do something than anybody else. I find that a lot of us think that we're maybe like the chosen ones. Sometimes it comes from like a religious point of view. And it really isn't meant to be that we're better than anybody else, something that narcissistic people would think. It more has to do with the fact that I think we think a lot about ourselves, which is, I guess, egocentrism and not in a narcissistic way, but I think how everything connects to us, which has to do with ideas of reference, that we think everything in the world is either a message to us or targeted towards us. And it's really hard to make that distinction, I think, at first. But yeah, that kind of has to do with it. And I think during my younger years, I definitely thought that I might have superpowers with the way I thought tied to this disorder. But you know, I ended up finding out it had to do more with being schizotypal as opposed to an actual genuine thought.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really fascinating answer. And the next element I think is a bit related to what you mentioned about connections. So for connected thinking, what type of connections do you typically make in your thinking? And is connected thinking a trait that you kind of enjoy, or do you find it challenging, or sort of a combination of both?
Yeah, so connected thinking, also known as magical thinking more popularly. This is probably my favorite trait out of all of them. I find that it's almost like a problem-solving skill because you're seeing how different topics can overlap and connect. And sometimes I find I get interesting insights that I think people overlook through that. So I guess an example would be like, oh, you can give me a topic, biology. And then I think about taxonomy and I think about the larger sciences, and it just goes on and on and on. And that's kind of how that works. But sometimes it can appear as a little bit weirder or maybe a little bit more controversial. I find that since we're able to connect all these different perspectives and I guess I guess has to do with like cognitive empathy. We can understand every perspective. So maybe sometimes we seem like fence sitters on like politics, or we can play devil's advocate a lot and choose that unpopular opinion just because we can see why the person thinks like that. I also find that maybe we go a little bit overboard with it, like we feel like we're being interviewed, I think, when we're alone, and I'll sometimes like ramble off and pretend like I'm answering different kind of questions and preparing for that if that happens in the future. I guess another example would be too, like I try and organize things, but the topic seems like it's in multiple categories, and if you're dividing it into singular categories, it get a little bit overwhelming because you're constantly thinking about the connections between these things, where most people would just choose like uh, a distinction and then run with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next one is kind of a little bit of a jump in topic, but disordered speech and unusual or eccentric dressing or style are also kind of typically mentioned in combination with StPD. Do you experience that? And if so, what's that like?
Yeah, definitely both. And it's kind of weird because I think from the outside looking in, it seems a little bit disordered, but from my perspective, I always thought that I spoke normally. So I often fold, which has to do with it's like the organization of like a sentence or a thought. I'll perhaps put like the end of the sentence in the beginning and maybe the middle comes before the first part. And someone described it as that on Reddit and it was absolutely perfect because that's exactly how it comes out. And that's why it seems like certain ideas don't seem fully formed or disorganized when I say them. But it makes sense to me, I guess. And I ramble a lot. And I often redefine words too. Um, I think an example is I use this word heady, and I didn't know what it meant. I just assumed it meant like cerebral or something like that, and I guessed. It ended up being true, but I still kind of redefined it at the time because I didn't know for sure. And then with like odd dress, it can be beyond just dressing eccentrically. I think people think like Willy Wonka is a common example of like dressing eccentrically, but it could be more than that. It can be dressing with mismatched clothing. I'm not much of a fashion guru myself. I just kind of throw on whatever and go outside. Also, like all black clothing to blend in more is one of the reasons, and or ill-fitting clothing, etc., etc.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I will say, I think your definition of the word heady actually makes more sense, at least on a literal level. So I like the way that you've redefined that word. And then the last element under this question is just kind of a few things together, but inappropriate effect. I'm not sure how really inappropriate sounds like kind of a harsh term there, but maybe atypical effect, unusual perceptions, ideas of reference. These are also kind of listed under StPD as common traits. Um, are there any of those that you would like to describe?
Oh yeah, so inappropriate effect I know often comes at like laughing at inappropriate times, and I have so many examples of that. I'd be watching maybe like a dramatic or a dark movie and I'd suddenly laugh and it makes no sense. It's really weird, but I'm usually just thinking about something that I found funny. Um, I'll give you an example. I was talking with two classmates and they'd been asking me, "Oh, what are my plans next semester?" And what I initially said was, "Oh, well, I shouldn't tell you this." And then I suddenly paused and I just laughed hysterically out of nowhere. And it was really weird for them. But what I was thinking in my perspective is, well, why would I even share something if it needs to be so secret, right? Like that's absurd to even make that mistake. And then also I was talking with two people who probably gossip the most in my class, so it's just that all together just seemed really funny to me and in a millisecond for some reason my brain's able to like comprehend those scenarios and that's why we'll like laugh at weird points I find.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I really appreciate your patience and taking the time to answer kind of all the traits in that question, and definitely found it really insightful. So I know like kind of just now we went through things that maybe were a bit more aligned with the official or DSM criteria for schizotypal personality. Are there other experiences that you've had that are related to schizotypal personality that might not be as commonly recognized or maybe aren't listed in the DSM?
Oh, yeah. Going back to the last question, I forgot I didn't cover unusual perceptions and ideas and
Oh,
reference. My
sure.
bad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
so with unusual perceptions, that can be like, I think hearing voices. I think the big distinction between like the other schizophrenia spectrum disorders is that usually it'll be very brief and maybe one word stuff. Tactile hallucinations, I don't see mentioned a lot, but it does actually happen within schizotypal. And that can feel like bugs or something are crawling up your skin and just weird sensations that I always thought were normal, but ended up being part of the disorder. Um, Deja vu feeling I find is really common. Um, and I think it has to do with like the way memory is encoded. I'm not a professional on that, but definitely deja vu feelings is really common. Like I've been there before. For ideas of reference, sometimes it feels like people are talking about us or we feel persecuted. For example, when a person yawns during a conversation, I immediately interpret that as, oh, they think we're boring or we need to switch up the topic or they don't like us, let's leave. And it can go really far with interpreting these just, normal, subtle signs and stuff like that. Going to like other, I guess, things outside of the normal DSM traits. Another one I think is low latent inhibition, which basically means we have less self control. And I found that I've gotten addicted to different things a lot quicker, like gaming and social media and all of that. Another one is avolition and anhedonia. These are usually referred to as like schizophrenia type traits and not so much schizotypal. It's a little bit of a debate whether or not maybe we can include that or not, but I find that some people definitely do have that. Um, Anhedonia means you kind of just don't feel as much. And I feel indifferent sometimes when I'm used to be really passionate about something, I'll flip back and forth. With avolition, it's kind of like a lack of motivation, even to do the most basic tasks, like pay your bills. You know, you just click one button and you pay the bill, but yet I still won't do that. And it's just that lack of kind of energy, but also just, motivation. And one more thing that I mentioned is the repulsion attraction pattern, which I think Milton posited. And it kind of has to do with what I mentioned earlier, where at one moment I'll feel so excited and elated to do something like a goal. And then suddenly I'll talk myself out of it. I'll say, oh, well, I don't actually really like that. Or, oh, I might not be good enough to do that. And it's hard to say, what that might be. It might be social anxiety, it might be something else, a lack of confidence, but we definitely, I think, have that, and it's not really mentioned too much, but for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. It's really interesting, I think, especially to hear about these special topics. The next question is a little bit of a jump in topic, but before you were diagnosed with schizotypal personality, what were some other places that you turned to for information or for kind of attempts to find self-understanding?
Yeah, so since I was really young, maybe about like middle school or such like that, I kind of realized that I wasn't doing so hot in school, and I tried to explain why I wasn't doing very well in school. So I looked into IQ, theory of multiple intelligences, the Myers-Briggs, maybe even like LGBTQ plus. And I eventually settled on having avoidant personality disorder, which is another type of personality disorder. But yeah, I'd always been looking for an answer unknowingly, and I didn't really figure out why until I actually got diagnosed earlier this year. And I think other people probably have as well. Because it's very clear that we're very different than other people, but we just don't know the exact answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like there's so little information about schizotypal personality out there in general.
Yes.
And when you were growing up, what was your experience like with friends or classmates?
Yeah, so I was definitely very, very shy, but very friendly and chill. And I actually had quite a few friends. I think partly that has to do with as kids. I think kids, I've heard both sides of the coin, but I actually found that they're more understanding and cool as long as you're cool and you have the same interests. So I think I was pretty normal enough from the outside looking in. And that's also partly because I kept my inner world separate from everybody else, mainly out of fear. I had watched movies and TV, and they always interpret as the person who's weird or eccentric as the person who gets put in the loony bin and stuff like that. And luckily, we've progressed so much, I think, as a society just within the last century with how we treat and deal with mental health. But that, I think, as a kid, you don't really know that much. You only know what you see on TV and what other kids talk about, and that's really why I kept this side of myself secret. And I think that's why it took so long to be diagnosed.
Absolutely. I've also found children to be, on average, a little bit more accepting. Um,
Mm,
yeah, it'd be great if people could keep that quality as we grow up.
yeah.
Kind of building on the last point you mentioned, may I ask how you were diagnosed with schizotypal personality and what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, so for several years, I thought I had avoidant personality disorder, and I kind of felt like I had imposter syndrome because I wasn't officially diagnosed. And I was like, okay, I'll go in for a personality assessment by a licensed psychologist, and we'll see, right? And I was really expecting to have it, but when I finally got that diagnosis and they said I had schizotypal, at first I freaked out because I thought it was schizophrenia. And I didn't really know much about schizophrenia except from the stereotypes, and unfortunately, they're often negative. So my first reaction was, oh, am I going to commit crime? Which is a horrible misunderstanding, of what people with schizophrenia are like. But I think that just shows that how little people know about schizotypal or personality disorders, let alone the misunderstandings that we have about very popular disorders, whether it be schizophrenia or ADHD or autism.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point about how, yeah, there's misconceptions about both conditions. And then this question is a little bit long, but what advice do you have for clinicians and or mental health workers who would like to work with people who have schizotypal personality? And kind of as a sub question under that, are there any common misconceptions or pitfalls that you wish more clinicians were aware of regarding StPD?
Yeah, so I think my biggest piece of advice is just patience and don't push. And you can say that about any type of patient, but I think it can probably feel frustrating for a clinician when neurodiverse people, just in general, I don't think we make as quick progress as other people and definitely not in similar ways. And that's why I always say it's just patience. It might take us a lot longer to maybe show the same amount of progress as a neurotypical, but as long as you're patient with us, we actually really appreciate that, even if we don't voice that. I think from the schizotypal perspective in particular, we think you're going to hand our medical files to the government. And of course, that's not true. But that's just kind of our perspective and why we might withhold stuff and we don't really want to, I guess, work alongside you in case, oh, maybe that you're not in our best interest. Um,
Thank you. I completely agree that patience is so important, and probably good for therapists to be aware that they shouldn't be rushing patients, especially if patients might be already experiencing some distrust towards them.
yes, yeah.
Um, the next question is also a little bit of a jump in topic, but are there any aspects of having STPD, or I guess just of life more generally that you especially enjoy?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course. Are there aspects of STPD, or I guess just life in general, that you especially enjoy?
Um, yeah, definitely so. I think personally that we can be very, very, I think, talented, creative people. And that's not just with like art and music. I think creativity can occur in anything like business or science and such like that. And I think we have this ability to walk between different worlds where people are normally good at maybe one or a few things. I think we have interest and curiosity in all of them. And I think that can be a really powerful tool, not even just in the workplace, but also in your personal life. So yeah, that ability to connect all these different topics and see value in them, I think is really the coolest part about having schizotypal.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the flip side, are there parts of schizotypal personality that you find especially challenging?
Yeah, I believe that the downside, the challenges still make up most of the disorder. I'd say over 90%. And while each trait, I think, provides a powerful tool like connected thinking, and such like that, and even paranoia in certain circumstances, like it's good to be prepared in case, something bad happens, but maybe not to the extent that sometimes we do it. I think being able to really rein in these traits and making sure that you don't go overboard with that thought, those negative thoughts, is really, really difficult. Um, you know, I know I've permanently burned bridges and friendships with people because I wasn't able to rein in these traits myself. So, um, yeah, I find it very difficult. Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for answering that. Um, the next question is one that I'm especially excited to ask. I think you'd suggested it, and I think it's a fantastic question. So it's what makes you an individual among schizotypals? As you know, each person is still unique despite the shared experience of having schizotypal personality.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the main one is probably, I found in literature they said on average we're clumsy and uncoordinated, but I was actually really athletic as a kid. So that's definitely something that's different. Um, I'd also say that I think due to paranoid fears, we kind of want to stay in the shadows and relatively unknown, anonymous people. But for me, I actually do want to become a famous public figure, shockingly. Um, and I'd also say that I think I'm a little bit more pragmatic, not smarter, but I think I see things a little bit more grounded than other schizotypals. That thought mainly comes from like religion and conspiracy theories. Me personally, I think they're fun, and I understand maybe like the interest in them, but I always kind of thought they were a little absurd, so I don't really entertain them as much as I think other schizotypals do.
Thank you so much. And then the last question is just, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, yeah, to my fellow schizotypals, I want you to know that you're not alone and I hope you're doing well. Um, and while you're not obligated to do so, I think all of us slowly bringing awareness actually helps us as a collective. So if you're being brave enough to maybe share like a comment that you thought, oh, might be used against you, doing little things like that and showing your presence online does actually help. I guess to everybody else, thank you for your curiosity in learning about different disorders and stuff, because I think empathy is one of the most crucial skills of the human race in ensuring that our species continues to progress and survive. So, and thank you, Sam, for having me on. I really appreciate it. And yeah,
Of course, thank you so much for, yeah, for taking the time to be on here and to share such great and, you know, thorough insights about schizotypal personality. I know I found it really, really interesting and appreciated a lot. So thank you.
of course.